Hello, I am Reverend Breanna Illéné with the Wisconsin Council of Churches, and today I am joined by Reverend Dr. Leah Schade to talk about what we can do in an election season as clergy and as churches. Leah, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Brianna. I'm Leah Schade. I teach preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary. I'm also the co-founder of the Clergy Emergency League, a network of clergy across the U.S. that are supporting each other during this divisive time in our political life.
So you've got a PowerPoint and you're gonna share a little
Yes.
bit some tips and tricks and ways for clergy to handle this season.
Yes, absolutely. So let me get my screen share here. Today, we're going to talk about what clergy can say and not say during the election season and how to say it. And after I go through this PowerPoint, Brianna and I will have some time together to talk about some of these things. And we'll also be turning this into an article for our respective websites so you can have this information and also share it with your congregation. A little bit of background here. First of all, we need to understand that churches are 501c3 organizations. This means that they are nonprofit charitable organizations, and they're tax exempt. So that classification means that there are certain things that churches can't do because if they do it, it will jeopardize their nonprofit status. And we're going to talk about what some of those things are today. However, there are ways for the church in general, and for preachers in particular, to address issues that affect their lives and their communities and bring religious teachings and ethics about those issues into their discourse, at the same time staying within the bounds of the law. In my book, Preaching and Social Issues, Tools and Tactics for Empowering Your Prophetic Voice, I recommend that when preachers are thinking about how they're going to talk about social issues, that they take some time to assess what their context is. So if their church has never really engaged in these topics before, or if there is some political discord, you might want to take a more gentle approach. And I'll talk some more in a little bit about what those approaches are. But if your church is more comfortable with these conversations, then you might want to take an invitational approach. And if your church has been doing this sort of thing for a long time, that they are engaged in the public square and they don't have a problem having these conversations, then you can take what I would call a robust approach. So keep these frameworks in mind because this will help you think about when we're going through the do's and the don'ts of preaching during the election season. You can think about, well, how does this apply in my context? So one thing that you can't do in the church is to endorse candidates or give them money as a congregation, okay? It doesn't mean that individuals within the congregation can't do this, but the church entity itself can't do this. However, the church can educate and encourage. So you can tell people how to vote, how to find information about where they can register to vote, where polling places are, what will be on the ballot, whether voter ID will be required, and what kind of ID will suffice for that. The church can also share nonpartisan voting guides about what's on the ballot. So this is about educating people, not taking a position one way or the other. And it's always a good idea to remind people to vote, that their voice is important, that their agency within our process of how we determine the ways we're going to live as a community matters to God, matters to our communities, and is okay to do. This means that churches can also participate in nonpartisan get out the vote activities, such as voter registration, or going around and putting flyers on to say, it's time to vote. Here's when you vote. Here's where you vote. You can do that and not get in trouble with the IRS. But You can't allow a candidate to speak during a worship service. That would cross the line. There are options, however, for hosting a candidate forum, as long as all candidates have been invited to that forum. Now, they may come on different days. They might not want to be in the same room together, but as long as you as a church invite both candidates or more than one candidate to be part of this, that is okay, because this is about education. It's also okay to share questionnaires. Like, so if your church sent a questionnaire to the different candidates on the ballot and said, these are issues that we're concerned about, would you respond to them? And then you share the feedback that you get, you can do that as long as all candidates are invited. But you can't print, distribute, or post online materials that rank the candidates on what they say on issues, like whether they agree or disagree with us. That you can't do. But you can, as a church, lobby on specific legislation. So if there are certain bills that have been introduced or going to be introduced in the legislature, a church can definitely take a policy stand on that issue and can preach and have educational forums about that. They just can't target candidates themselves. This means that the congregation cannot endorse candidates. So you can't say our church endorses candidate A or opposes candidate B. But clergy can speak about their own personal, moral, and ethical discernment, because that is their First Amendment right as a citizen. And you have to be really careful about this, but you can talk about how you're discerning ethically, morally, biblically about issues and about stances that are taken on issues, as long as you clarify that you are not speaking for the church. You are speaking as a private citizen, that your view does not represent your denomination if you're part of one, or your congregation. But it's important for your congregation to know that you, as a moral and ethical person, are wrestling with these things, and these are the questions that you bring to it. So this means that you can preach about social issues during an election season. We can be political in the sense that polis means of the people, of the community. So the Bible itself has all kinds of issues that have to do with the community. The Bible itself is political in that sense. But we can't be partisan. We can't say that we endorse the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or the Independent or the Green Party or whatever. That we can't do. But political, yes. So this is a really good quote from the United Church of Christ Justice and Witness Ministries, Bernice Powell Jackson, who said, politics is about the values we honor, the dollars we allocate, and the process we follow so that we can live together with some measure of justice, order, and peace. So this is the way that we can talk about social issues. So you have to think about what your approach is. So if you are in a situation where it's a little more tentative and you want to take a gentle approach, this means that you can name the issue and frame it biblically. You can share your own struggles or your own discernment about a particular issue. And you can also say that, there are a lot of emotions that come up around these issues. And we as a congregation need to think about this, and that God invites us into this conversation, which leads to another aspect of approaching social issues, which is what I call invitational. So in this, you can do a tactic of telling stories that create empathy, so that people understand that the headlines and the policies and the issues aren't just something that's abstract, that it affects people in real ways. I also, in my book, Preaching in the Purple Zone, talk about the sermon process, where you preach an invitational sermon that says, I don't have the answers, but I am really interested in the questions. And we can talk about that as a church because the Bible models talking about these issues. And then you have a nonpartisan dialogue about issues, and then a follow-up sermon that says, here's what we talked about, and here's how God is leading us going forward. And you can also talk about the history, mission, and future of the congregation. what have we been and who have we been and what have we done in the past? What is our mission right now? And what is our future on these particular issues that we can be guided on? And then finally, with robust, this is in a situation where your congregation is on board, everybody is aligned, ready to do this level of work. In this case, you can be blunt and be bold. You can call out the issues, can name those things very clearly. But it's also really important to collaborate with people before, during, and after so that people are educated and involved. And then equipping people for justice so that they can think about how to put their faith into action. So, in terms of biblical, moral, and ethical principles, I want to draw from Jim Antall's work in an article called "The Time Is Now for the Election Sermon." And he has 4 themes that I think can be really helpful for any sermon during an election. One is that God values all people. So we can think about, how do the candidates' past record and current promises support care for the most vulnerable among us? Another theme is about the common good. How do the candidates preserve and advance justice while promoting the common good? So it's not just about a certain group getting power, that we all are part of this, that we're all part of the common people, having common air, common water, common ground, common shared ethical principles. Also, caring for our common home. It's not just about us as human beings, but how do we look at the positions and policies and practices that have to do with protecting and preserving the planet that we share? Because if we don't have a livable planet, none of this is going to matter. And then a 4th theme is about honesty and truth. And so we can ask, how do candidates' advertising, endorsements, and other campaigning reveal who they are in terms of telling the truth and adhering to the truth? So finally, I want to share with you just 3 things that you might want to think about to prepare for an election sermon before you even get into the pulpit to do this. So have some preparatory conversation with your congregation's leadership group, whether that's your council or board of elders. Not that you're going to ask for permission, but to say, this is what I'm going to do, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, your feedback about this, so that nobody is surprised, that everybody knows this is what you're planning to do, and that way they are informed. Another thing that you can do is, if you know there are certain people in the congregation who might react negatively ahead of time, take some time to talk to them to say, I feel really called to talk about this particular issue, and I really want to hear your thoughts about it as well. So you're honoring where they're coming from. You can try to find some common ground, but to also note that there are some differences, and people will appreciate that honesty and authenticity. And then a 3rd thing that you can do is to talk with clergy colleagues or your mentor about your sermon. Might be good to sort of test drive it with them ahead of time, ask them for suggestions and feedback. I'll conclude with a quote from my book, Preaching and Social Issues. Preach in a way that proclaims who God is, what God has done and is doing now, and what this means for our lives in community today. Lift up the big questions that underlie the headlines or controversies. Acknowledge the complexities of individual human sin, as well as systemic evil, then frame these questions biblically and theologically. Be fair and avoid creating straw men or taking cheap shots against those who you believe to be on the wrong side of an issue. Through empathy, authenticity, and rhetorical tactics that engage different perspectives, preachers can help listeners encounter the gospel that people don't want to hear, that will, through God's transformative power, be life-giving, hope-building, and world-changing. So I'll stop there because I know Breanna has some questions and suggestions to add to our conversation here.
Yeah, we've already had people reaching out to us at the Wisconsin Council of Churches to ask, like, hey, can I do this thing? Can I how do I handle this? So this is super helpful, and I'm excited to get these facts out. One of the questions that we've had at the council is, hey, a local political party is looking for space. Churches are often used as community centers. Can they use our space to do a political campaign event or to do some political activities? Do you want to take that one, Leah?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that's is a it relates to inviting people just to talk at your congregation. Um, if you're going to let one person do it, you got to let anybody else who's available and who wants to. You cannot just limit your space to one candidate. That's my understanding. Breanna, what kind of advice are you giving to churches?
It's from my understanding as well, it needs to be available to everyone. So one political party can rent it, but that means that it needs to be available that other political parties could also rent it or use it in the same way. That's the kind of legal answer, but there's also the pastoral answer of
Yeah, yeah,
where does your congregation fall? What does it look like in the season to do this? And is it a good idea? And so I think that's
yeah.
something to reflect on in this.
Absolutely. And I think that's where that conversation with your governing board ahead of time, so that if the invitation comes, you've already had this conversation and you're not trying to deal with the urgency of the moment. Um, you have to think about, what is this communicating to the larger community, to your denomination, about where you are? Because you may say, well, we opened it to anybody and this is the only one that showed up. But if that's the only one that shows up, it's still, the optics are that you're supporting this candidate. So I think that's a little trickier ground, unless you can say, look, we'd like to have both be able to rent at different times, so that we can say we have made this public space available. But if you are going to do that, it's really important to communicate and be transparent through your newsletter, through your website, through whatever communications there are, and conversation, to inform people that this is the decision that the church made, that the pastor didn't decide to do this. This was a church body decision, and this is what we're going to do going forward. The other thing just to keep in mind, that in this really politically volatile season, when there are some extremist groups that have been targeting churches, that if you do this kind of activity, you may be opening yourself up to some really negative pushback from those groups that are looking for high profile targets, and churches are that. So just be aware that that is a possibility.
Yeah. One of the other questions we've thought about is, what happens if somebody in my congregation is running for political office, and how do you handle that as a pastor? And I was even reflecting on, or what if your pastor is running for political office? I watched the Democratic National Convention. And you had Reverend Raphael Warnock spoke, and he is an elected official who is also a pastor. So how do you handle that in a congregation?
Yeah. Well, this is clearly where the separation of church and state comes into play. That the church cannot be used as the platform on which you make your announcement. It has to be on civil ground, because that is a civil activity that you are engaging in. It doesn't mean that you can't talk about it, but it's not, the church is not the place to launch it. So, because that would be clearly the church endorsing you by allowing you to use that space, those resources, to for your campaign. So there needs to be a really clear separation of your activities as a candidate and as a person in politics from your pastoral role. And again, you're going to have conversations with your governing board. Also, if you're in a denomination, get guidance from your ecclesial leader on this, and just have really clear and transparent boundaries, so that everybody is informed, and there can be lines of accountability.
And I think the same thing if like a member is running, to just be really transparent, and like they can openly share about the fact they're running, but they can't do campaigning and
Right. You
helping them
can't be
understand.
handing out brochures and that sort of thing. They can't say,
Yeah.
"Hey, I'm having an event. Can you all come?" You just that the church is just not the place to do that. So you have to keep those lines really clear.
Yeah. A few other options in this season I just want to lift up of like, because we've talked about how to do this from the pulpit, but there's so many ways that churches can be involved in this season. Um, some of the places that we're encouraging people is churches in many states are great polling locations, and polling locations are
Yes.
hard to find. Call your city clerk. And even if it might not be this November election, but get on their list and their radar to say, hey, if you need a location in this neighborhood, and if you have the space, like we are available. It's a great way to invite the community in and provide a really valuable resource. Um, we're also encouraging clergy to be poll chaplains. There are some national organizations, and also a lot of states are doing individual state organizations that are training people to be at the polls as de-escalating, nonpartisan, kind of cooling the temperature, creating safety and security forces on election day. And so reach out to kind of your local folks, or Leah and I know a few people doing this, and we can help connect you into that. Um, encourage people to get involved in the election process. There
Yes.
is a huge need for poll workers and election officials in our world right now. There are organizations, the League of Women Voters and ACLU are organizing election observers to just help do that transparent process, help make the process run more smoothly. And so there's a lot of nonpartisan ways to be really involved in the election process. And then I think it is clear to say, like, if you want to be involved in campaigns, that's fine too. Go be a voice in a campaign. You can't bring the campaign into the church, but encourage your members to say, if you really care about politics, yes, it is good to have people of faith who are active in these political parties and speaking up as a voice of justice, speaking up to say, hey, we are called to something greater. We are called to loving our neighbor. We are called to justice. We are called to compassion. We are called to grace. And I think that is desperately needed in this season. And then finally, I'll give a
Absolutely.
plug. The Wisconsin Council of Churches and the Clergy Emergency League have partnered and are creating resources. We have a whole Loving Your Neighbor in an Election Season campaign, which includes worship resources and all kinds of stuff. And so check out our websites, and we can continue to equip you to do this work. Anything else, Leah, you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to affirm that the the church can be a, a citizen in the public arena. We separation of church and state means that the state cannot impose a religion upon one religion upon the rest of the population, and that the church cannot dictate what the government can do. But that doesn't mean that people of faith can't have a say when they see something wrong, when they have concerns. That's what they're called to do. The prophets did it throughout the Bible. People of faith have done this for millennia. So it is okay for us to do this as long as we're aware of what the parameters are, we observe and protect those boundaries, and we engage in an authentic and transparent way. We can live out our faith in the public square.
That is our call. Thank you, Leah, for this conversation.
Thank you, Breanna.